Professor Meena Dhanda is a professor of philosophy and cultural politics. She has taught and researched in philosophy at Wolverhampton since 1992. She is currently engaged in doing empirically informed social, moral, and political philosophy with a focus on casteism as a kind of racism. She is currently a visiting professor at the London School of Economics. Professor Jayna Kothari is a professor of politics. She'll be joining us online. Her research interests are in liberalism and minority rights, constitution making, political representation, comparative political thought, political ideologies, and modern Indian politics. She is currently principal investigator of Pluralist Agreement and Constitutional Transformation Pact. Rochna's book, Debating Difference, Group Rights, and Liberal Democracy in India, offered the first systemic analysis of the Indian Constituent Assembly debates on group differentiated rights, focusing on religious and caste minorities. Finally, we have Professor Sukhadeo Thorat, who will also be joining us online, who is an Indian economist, educationalist, professor, and writer. He's the former chairman of the UGC. He's Professor Emeritus in Center for the Study of Regional Development, JNU. He's currently chairman, Institute for Social and Economic Change, Bangalore. He was also the director of the Indian Institute of Dalit Studies, New Delhi, and he has also received several awards, including the Padma Shri. So therefore, we'll begin the discussion now with Professor Jain going first.
Good afternoon, everybody. I must thank Government of Karnataka for giving me this wonderful opportunity to share my thoughts. I'm also indebted to National Law School, India University for having me here and part of this very stellar panel. I would like to pick a thread from Professor Krishnaswamy. He very rightly pointed out that a constitution can never be perfect. And in fact, a perfect constitution is supposedly the end of politics. And politics cannot end with the constitution. In fact, politics should begin with the inauguration of the constitution. So I am going to focus on one of the constitutional imperfections. Although my focus is on Indian constitution, but what I am going to talk also have ramifications on global constitutionalism. So the question with which I want to grapple with is, said addressing individual issues by taking accommodative measures. What about going into the root causes? What about going into the structures and systems of discrimination? What about challenging the ableist design of the legal system in its entirety? Because of the design of the legal system.
ಪರಿಗಣಿಸಬೇಕು. ಯಾಕಂದ್ರೆ ಇದು ಸ್ವಾಭಾವಿಕವಾಗಿರುವುದು. ವೈಕಲ್ಯ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿಗಳು ಸಮಾನತೆಯಾಗಿ ಪರಿಗಣಿಸಿದಾಗ ವಸ್ತುನಿಷ್ಠತೆ ಸ್ವಾಭಾವಿಕವಾಗಿ ಮೌಲ್ಯಗಳನ್ನ ಪರಿವರ್ತನೆಗೊಳ್ಳುತ್ತೆ. ಸಾಂಸ್ಥಿಕ ನ್ಯಾಯಾಂಗ ವ್ಯವಸ್ಥೆ ಇದಕ್ಕೆ ಪೂರಕವಾದ ಕೆಲಸವನ್ನು ಮಾಡಬೇಕು. ವೈಕಲ್ಯತೆಯು ವೈದಿಕ ಸಮಾನತೆ ಎನ್ನದೇ ಅದು ಸಾಮಾಜಿಕ ಸಮಸ್ಯೆ ಎಂದು ಪರಿಗಣಿಸಿ ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಕಾರಣ ಮತ್ತು ಪರಿಣಾಮಗಳನ್ನು ತಿಳಿಸಬೇಕು. ಇದರೊಂದಿಗೆ ಇಂತಹ ಸಮಸ್ಯೆಗಳಿಗೆ ಸೂಕ್ತವಾದ ಪರಿಹಾರ ನೀಡಬೇಕು. ವಿಶ್ವಸಂಸ್ಥೆಯು ಈ ಕುರಿತು ಹಲವಾರು ವಿಷಯಗಳನ್ನು ಚರ್ಚಿಸಿದೆ. ಅದನ್ನು ಪರಿಗಣಿಸಿ ನಾನು ಕರ್ನಾಟಕ ಸರ್ಕಾರಕ್ಕೆ ಮನವಿಯನ್ನು ಮಾಡಿಕೊಳ್ಳುತ್ತೇನೆ. ಕೇಂದ್ರ ಸರ್ಕಾರಕ್ಕೆ ಈ ವಿಷಯವನ್ನು ಮನವರಿಕೆ ಮಾಡಿ ಅಂಗವೈಕಲ್ಯ, ಮಾನಸಿಕ ಮತ್ತು ದೈಹಿಕ ಅಂಗವೈಕಲ್ಯಗಳಿಗೆ ಸೂಕ್ತವಾದ
ಪರಿಗಣಿಸಿ ಇದನ್ನು ನ್ಯಾಯರೂಪ ಒದಗಿಸಿದರೆ ಇದಕ್ಕೆ ಅರ್ಥ ಬರೋದಿದೆ ಎನ್ನುವಂಥ ಮಾತುಗಳನ್ನು ಸವಿಸ್ತಾರವಾಗಿ ಪ್ರಚುರಪಡಿಸಿರುವ ಪ್ರೊಫೆಸರ್ ಜೈನ್ ಅವರಿಗೆ ಧನ್ಯವಾದಗಳು.
Professor Rochna, we'd like you to go next. And the point that I was trying to make was Professor Jain was highlighting how there is this radical other versus natural difference, and that was making me think about group versus individual, and that is something that Rochna ma'am specializes in. So if you can take it from there and highlight on that aspect. Professor Rochna, can you hear me? You're muted, you're muted.
There in person like in the previous conference in 2017 when we were also on the same panel. And that was, on Dr. Ambedkar's contribution to constitution making.
Please go ahead. I think they are listening to you. Yeah.
I see. Right. I didn't realize that. Thank you very much for having me here. It's a great privilege and pleasure to be a part of this really impressive conference to mark the 75th anniversary of the Indian Constitution. I want to start out by, of course, expressing both my gratitude to the Government of Karnataka and NLSIU, and for apologizing to not be there in person due to teaching commitments at this time. But it's a great honor to be part of this panel. So my brief is to talk about how we think about equality and justice in relation to the Constitution and national unity. And I want to try to sketch out 5 or so approaches that we find to equality in the Constituent Assembly debates, both in the practices of decision making and in the ideas that were articulated in the Assembly, which I think are significant both conceptually as well as practically in suggesting ways out of the crisis of democracy that we face today. I've tried to show in some of my writings how majority and minority representatives came together to agree on a constitutional framework, which has flaws to be sure and is imperfect, as Professor Krishnaswamy pointed out, but which can still provide a unifying framework for the polity. The achievement of reaching agreement in a deeply divided assembly and in a society undergoing partition, and for the Constitution today to be one of the longest lived constitutions, the longest standing constitutions in the world, it's not an easy achievement, and that's something that we need to celebrate. But what were the conceptions of equality and justice that underpinned the agreement between very diverse and often conflicting opinions in the Constituent Assembly? The first sort of inequality that was sought to be addressed was in relation to decision making itself, We know that democracy is about political equality, yet those who belong to numerical minorities, whether these are defined by religion or caste or tribe or opinion, they have much less opportunity to influence decision making, collective decisions. And we see that in our politics today. However, unlike today, during constitution making, there was some attempt, however imperfect, to address this inequality between majority and minority opinion in decision making. In particular, on questions relating to marginalized groups and minorities, including reservations, the leaders in the assembly did not make decisions based on majority voting, but sought to consult with the range of opinion in the group concerned. Now, this involved negotiation, give and take, what some people don't like, which is the term compromise, but it involved negotiations in which both sides, the more powerful majority opinion as well as minority opinion, gave up some of their first preferences to agree to a constitution which we continue to celebrate in our midst. So to take the example of reservations, we know that these were not Dr. Ambedkar's first preference. He had initially asked for separate electorates for Dalits, nor were they Nehru's first preference, who had said that reservations could undermine ideals of secular democracy. And yet we find the Indian Constitution as perhaps the first in the world to constitutionalize affirmative action. Both leaders, both powerful leaders, accepted reservations, which were not the first preference of either leader, in order to reach an agreement. Now, this was not necessary for the Congress, for the dominant party, which had a huge numerical majority in the assembly. Based on numbers, they could have easily pushed through, Nehru and the party could have easily pushed through a vote against reservations if they had desired to do so. But that was not done, and I would argue that was not done also in the interests of national unity. We can come back to this in questions later. Now, moving on from processes of decision making to the ideas of equality and justice. In my book, Debating Difference, I distinguish between 4 or so different conceptions of equality or justice in the Constituent Assembly debates that were put forward both from within majority opinion as well as from those advocating for minorities, including in this period, Dalit and tribal groups who were initially categorized as minorities at the start of the debates. In India, as elsewhere, one route of opposition to affirmative action has been this idea of formal equality of opportunity, the idea that that reservations can diminish formal equality of opportunity. But against this, there were arguments, 2 powerful arguments that were put forward by members of the Constituent Assembly in favor of reservations for Dalits in particular. The first was the goal of reducing socio-economic inequalities, what we may call a consequentialist type of argument. So social justice as a way of reducing socio-economic inequalities, which again was seen as an impediment for national unity. So one of the arguments that was made by majority opinion, including many upper caste members of the Constituent Assembly, was that the creation of a more equal society, a more just society in the future required special provisions, even if this detracted from equality of opportunity for all individuals. Reservations were required to enable the realization of a more just society in the future, one that was more equal. Sorry, how much time do I have?
About 2 minutes.
Oh, right. A second argument was in terms of compensatory justice. And again, we find many members, many upper caste members speaking of the sins of forefathers to make the claim that the current and future generations of upper castes should pay the costs for this in the form of reservations. Now, there were two further arguments based on equality that we find from advocates for stronger provisions for Dalits and lower caste. One was the idea of social justice as fair equality of opportunity for all individuals, as distinct from formal equality of opportunity. And we find such arguments being put forward by S. Nagappa, by other members of the Constituent Assembly that emphasize that there wasn't a level playing field for members of disadvantaged groups, and that social justice as fair equality of opportunity required reservations. And finally, we had the argument from equality of status and equality of power, that reservations were required to change the inequalities of status and inequalities of power that were there in society, and that these would benefit greatly from the institutionalization and the constitutionalization of reservations. I want to just conclude by a speech of Dr. Ambedkar, which some of which has been cited in the previous session, but which is an important one for us to recall today. And it's one which links democracy to liberty, and which says that however well-intentioned our leaders may be, however far-sighted they may be, in a democracy, we all are equal politically, and that requires us to think for ourselves and to not put our liberties at the feet of a dictator, no matter how well-intentioned or far-seeing they may be. In this, as in many other areas, Dr. Ambedkar was much ahead of his time in anticipating the crises of democracy that we witnessed today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Rochna. We'd like the translator to please translate what Professor Rochna just said.
ಹಲೋ ರೋಚನಾ ಭಾಸ್ಪೆ ಡಾಕ್ಟರ್ ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ ಅವರ ಭಾರತ ಸಂವಿಧಾನ ಮತ್ತು ರಾಷ್ಟ್ರೀಯ ಏಕತೆ ಸಮಾವೇಶಗೊಂಡಿರುವ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕ ಸರ್ಕಾರಕ್ಕೆ ನನ್ನ ಅಭಿನಂದನೆಗಳನ್ನು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳುತ್ತಾ, ಆ್ಯಕ್ಚುಲಿ ಸಂವಿಧಾನ ಹೇಗೆ ಸಮಾನತೆಯನ್ನು ನೀಡುತ್ತೆ, ಸಂವಿಧಾನದ ಸಭೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ವಾಸ್ತವಿಕ ಚರ್ಚೆಗಳ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಬಹಳ ಕೂಲಂಕುಷವಾಗಿ ವಿಶ್ಲೇಷಿಸಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಆ್ಯಕ್ಚುಲಿ ಭಾರತವನ್ನು ಅವರು ಬಹುತ್ವ ಭಾರತದ ಕಾನ್ಸೆಪ್ಟನ್ನು ಇಟ್ಕೊಂಡು ಅನಾಲಿಸಿಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾರೆ. ಬಹುತ್ವ ಭಾರತ ಭಾಳ ಅಗತ್ಯವಿದೆ. ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಬಹುತ್ವ ಭಾರತ ಬಹುಸಂಖ್ಯಾತರು ಮತ್ತು ಅಲ್ಪಸಂಖ್ಯಾತರ ನಡುವೆ ಒಂದು ಚರ್ಚೆ ಅಥವಾ ಸಂವಾದವಾಗಿದೆ. ಜಗತ್ತಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಮಹತ್ವವಾಗಿ ಸಂವಿಧಾನವನ್ನು ನಾವೆಲ್ಲರೂ ಅರ್ಥ ಮಾಡ್ಕೋಬೇಕು. ಪ್ರಜಾಪ್ರಭುತ್ವ ರಾಜಕೀಯವಾಗಿ ಪಡೆಯದೆ ಆ್ಯಕ್ಚುಲಿ ಅದು ಬಹುಜನರ ಹಿತಕ್ಕಾಗಿ ಚಾಲ್ತಿಯಲ್ಲಿರುವುದು ಬಹಳ ಮಹತ್ವದಾಗಿದ್ದು. ಉದಾಹರಣೆಯಾಗಿ ಜಾತ್ಯತೀತ ಪ್ರಜಾಪ್ರಭುತ್ವ ಸಂವಿಧಾನಬದ್ಧ ಮತ್ತು ಕಾನೂನು ಆ್ಯಕ್ಚುಲಿ ನೆಹರು ಮತ್ತು ಕಾಂಗ್ರೆಸ್ ಅಭಿಪ್ರಾಯಪಟ್ಟಿದ್ರು. ಆದರೆ ಅದರಲ್ಲಿ ಬಾಬಾ ಸಾಹೇಬ್ ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ ಅವರು ಸಮಾನತೆ ಮತ್ತು ಸಮಪಾಲು ಅನ್ನುವಕ್ಕಂಥ ಆಶಯವನ್ನು ಅಭಿಪ್ರಾಯ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಪಡಿಸುತ್ತಾರೆ. ಭಾರತೀಯರಿಗೆ ಎರಡು ಪ್ರಮುಖವಾದ ವಾದಗಳಿದೆ. ಒಂದು ಸಾಮಾಜಿಕ ನ್ಯಾಯ, ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಸಮಾನತೆ, ಸಮಾಜ ನಿರ್ಮಾಣ ಮಾಡುವಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದು. ಇನ್ನು ಸಾಮಾಜಿಕ ನ್ಯಾಯ ಎಲ್ಲ ಹಂತದಲ್ಲಿಯೂ ಸಿಗಬೇಕು. ಅವರ ಕೊನೆಯ ಮಾತು ಏನಾಗಿತ್ತು ಅಂದರೆ, ಸಮಾನತೆ, ಸಾಂಸ್ಕೃತಿಕ ಸಂವಿಧಾನ ಬಹಳ ಅಗತ್ಯ. ಮುಕ್ತಾಯದಲ್ಲಿ ಡಾಕ್ಟರ್ ಬಾಬಾ ಸಾಹೇಬ್ ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ ಅವರ ಒಂದು ಮಾತುಗಳನ್ನು ಹೇಳ್ತಾ ಅವರ ಮಾತುಗಳನ್ನು ಮುಕ್ತಾಯಗೊಳಿಸ್ತಾರೆ. ಪ್ರಜಾಪ್ರಭುತ್ವದಲ್ಲಿ ರಾಜಕೀಯವಾಗಿ ನಮಗೆ ಪ್ರಜಾಪ್ರಭುತ್ವವನ್ನು ಸಿಕ್ಕಿದೆ, ಆದರೆ ಸಾಮಾಜಿಕವಾಗಿ ಆರ್ಥಿಕವಾಗಿ ಇನ್ನೂ ಅಸಮಾನತೆಯನ್ನು ಹೀಗೆ ಮುಂದುವರೆದಿದೆ. ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಸಂವಿಧಾನದ ಆಶಯ ಸಾಮಾಜಿಕ ಮತ್ತು ಆರ್ಥಿಕವಾಗಿ ಸಮಪಾಲು ಮತ್ತು ಸಮಬಾಳು ಕೊಡುವುದೇ ಅವರ ಆಶಯ ಆಗಿತ್ತು. ಧನ್ಯವಾದಗಳು ಮೇಡಮ್.
Like Jayna to go next. Yeah.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this panel. panel and this conference. It's my honor to be here with the other speakers, and especially to be speaking on the topic of equality, which has often not been focused upon when we talk about constitutional development. So I'm glad that there is this panel today. So the panel is titled Ensuring Equality and Equity, and that is the area that I would like to focus on today. And I think in some ways I will be developing on both what Dr. Jain and Dr. Bajpai briefly mentioned in their presentation as well. So often, I mean, the Constitution speaks about equality, but often equality and equity are often used together, sometimes interchangeably, when we discuss equality. And so why is that? Often in movements, in social movements, from the women's movements, feminist movements, Dalit movements, often the term equity is preferred. We've often hear some of the conversations saying that we don't want equality, we want equity. And so what is this confusion, and how do we disentangle this confusion between equity and equality? Are they the same? Are they different? And what are the ideas behind these concepts? I think initially I'd like to go back to equality. Equality under the Constitution is not just, of course, in Article 14, which guarantees equality under the laws and equal protection of the laws, but there's an entire equality code, which ranges from a wide range of articles, 14, 15, 16, 17 on untouchability, 18. You have the directive principles on social and economic justice and economic equality. Big change. And therefore, equity was often used, and it is, I think, to a large extent still being used. And perhaps to refer to the words of Mata Mino, she's written on equity versus equality, and speaks about how equity was often used under the framework of substantive equality. Dr. Jain spoke about substantive equality, but in our jurisprudence of the Supreme Court, substantive equality has been, so the formal equality model has really been discarded and replaced by the substantive equality model, which looks at historical disadvantage, looks at inequalities which are arising out of either group characteristics or personal characteristics, and how do we ultimately ensure with the difference is actually addressed so that people can ensure that they're treated and able to have equal opportunity. So I think a lot of these, the so-called dissatisfaction with the earlier formal equality model, which led to maybe a claim of equity in movements, has largely been addressed by our framework of substantive equality, and that is also there not just in some of the equality cases, but also in areas of reservation and affirmative action. In fact, in many of the affirmative action cases and reservation cases, including Indira Sawhney and many of the others, where courts have specifically said that equity claim was to get compensatory treatment, equality of results, and equality of opportunity. And
Jayna,
I think...
Jayna, sorry, I'll have to cut you. Just wrap up in, yeah.
Okay, I'll just wrap up. So I think, and I think our understanding of our courts and equality has gone far beyond even these requirements. Today, the equality jurisprudence or the larger understanding of equality includes not just the claims that I have discussed, but also looks at addressing negative stereotypes and biases, looks at addressing systemic equality, and looks at positive obligations in the form of reasonable accommodations. It also looks at how do we link equality with dignity. And one of the claims of dignity has been the recognition of equal worth of all persons. And that has been included within our understanding of equality to say that can equality mean the recognition of equal claim, equal worth of all persons, so that irrespective of the person's background or disadvantage, the person is recognized and given equal respect. So I will stop here, and I will end with saying that our understanding of our courts and our interpretation of equality has gone far beyond what we started with. We are now at a place where we have a very strong and robust interpretation of equality, and that is something we need to take forward, going forward by maybe even looking at a legislation that addresses equality and non-discrimination and takes many of the challenges of the Constitution forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Jayna. Now we'll request for the translation.
ಪ್ರೊಫೆಸರ್ ಕೊಠಾರಿ ಅವರು ಸಾಂಸ್ಕೃತಿಕ ಸಮಾನತೆ ಏಕೆ, ದಲಿತ ಸಮಾನತೆ ಮತ್ತು ಸಮಪಾಲು ಏಕೆ ಬೇಕು ಅನ್ನುವಂಥ ಮಾತುಗಳನ್ನು ಭಾಳ ಮಾರ್ಮಿಕವಾಗಿ ಆಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಸಂವಿಧಾನದಲ್ಲಿ ಸಮಾನತೆಯ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಆರ್ಟಿಕಲ್ 15, 14 ಮತ್ತು ಅಸ್ಪೃಶ್ಯತೆ ನಿವಾರಣೆ 17, 18 ಸಂವಿಧಾನದ ಮೂಲ ಆಶಯಗಳನ್ನು ಕುರಿತು ಮಾತನಾಡಿದರು. ಸಮಾನತೆ ಕೆಲಸಕ್ಕೆ ಸಮಾನ ವೇತನ ಕೊಡಬೇಕು. ಆ್ಯಕ್ಚುಲಿ ಚಂಪಕರಾಜ್ ಪ್ರಕರಣದಲ್ಲಿ ಹಲವಾರು ಸಮುದಾಯಗಳಿಗೆ ತಾರತಮ್ಯ ಕುರಿತು ಅವರು ಮಾತನಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಸಮಪಾಲು ಅಂದರೆ ಏನು, ಸಮಪಾಲು ವ್ಯವಸ್ಥಿತವಾಗಿ ಬದಲಾವಣೆಗೆ ಅಗತ್ಯವಾದ ತಾರತಮ್ಯವನ್ನು ಅಂತ್ಯಗೊಳಿಸಿ ಹೇಗೆ ಸಮಪಾಲು ಕೊಡಬೇಕು, ಸಮಾನ ವೇತನಕ್ಕೆ ಸಮಾನ ಕೆಲಸಕ್ಕೆ ಸಮಾನ ವೇತನ ಎನ್ನುವಂಥ ಮಾತುಗಳನ್ನು ಆಡಿದರು. ಜೊತೆಗೆ ನಮ್ಮ ಸಂವಿಧಾನದಲ್ಲಿ ಆಶಯ ಆ್ಯಕ್ಚುಲಿ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿಗೆ ಸಮಪಾಲು ಅಗತ್ಯವಾದ ಅಂಶವಾಗಿದೆ. ಸಾಮಾಜಿಕ ನ್ಯಾಯ ಸಿಗುವುದರಲ್ಲಿ ಮತ್ತು ಮೌಲ್ಯಗಳನ್ನು ಗುರುತಿಸುವುದರಲ್ಲಿ ಸಮಾನ ಅವಕಾಶಕ್ಕೆ ಮತ್ತು ಸಮಪಾಲಕ್ಕೆ ಪ್ರಮುಖವಾದ ಮಹತ್ವವಾಗಿದೆ. ಇಂದಿರಾಸಾನಿ ಪ್ರಕರಣದಲ್ಲಿಯೂ ಸಾಮಾಜಿಕ ತಾರತಮ್ಯದ ಕುರಿತು ಮಾತನಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಅಂತ ಮಾತು ಹೇಳಿದರು. ಇವತ್ತು ಸಾಮಾಜಿಕ ನ್ಯಾಯ ಅಷ್ಟೇ ಅಲ್ಲ, ಸಾಮಾಜಿಕ ಸಮಾನತೆ, ಸಾಮಾಜಿಕ ಪರಿವರ್ತನೆ ಸಕಾರಾತ್ಮಕವಾಗಿ ಇವುಗಳನ್ನು ಅಳವಡಿಸಿಕೊಂಡಾಗ ಅಥವಾ ಸಂವಿಧಾನದ ಇದನ್ನು ಇಂಪ್ಲಿಮೆಂಟ್ ಮಾಡಿದಾಗ ತುಂಬ ಅರ್ಥಪೂರ್ಣ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿ ಗೌರವ ಅತ್ಯಂತ ಮಹತ್ವವಾಗಿದ್ದು ನಾವು ಕೊನೆಯ ಮಾತು ಏನು ಹೇಳ್ತಾರೆ ಅಂದರೆ, ಅರ್ಥೈಸಿಕೊಳ್ಳಬೇಕಾಗಿದ್ದು ಸಮಾನತೆ ಮತ್ತು ಸಮಪಾಲು ನ್ಯಾಯಾಂಗ ವ್ಯವಸ್ಥೆಯಿಂದ ಪ್ರತಿಯೊಬ್ಬ ನಾಗರಿಕರು ಸಿಗಬೇಕಾಗಿರ್ಬೇಕಂತದ್ದು ಇಂತಿನ ಜರೂರಿ ಅನ್ನುವಂಥ ಮಾತುಗಳು ಹೇಳಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅವರಿಗೆ ಹೃದಯಪೂರ್ವಕ ಅಭಿನಂದನೆಗಳು. ಧನ್ಯವಾದ.
Thank you, sir. Professor Thorat, we'd like you to go next. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Well, good afternoon to all of you, and thank you very much, Vishnu Swami, the Vice Chancellor, for inviting me. I am one of those who are the part of the organization of this conference, but because of my health issue, I am not able to come. And so I miss many of the people here, Meena Dhanda and other who I would have liked to meet personally. Well, this is a conference on equity and constitution, and given a limited time, I would like to only focus on one or two issues. I think the Indian Constitution has a provision about equity and equality and non-discrimination, which is, in my view, is very strong.
Now you both decide amongst yourselves.
I don't mind.
Oh, sorry, I was invited. Is there any problem?
No, we lost you actually for some time.
There was a blip, but you can continue. I will stop. I will start after you finish. No worries.
Okay, so you can continue, then we'll come back.
Oh, I should continue.
Yes.
Okay.
We lost network.
You asked me to speak, that is why I began to speak, yeah. So what I was saying is that the Constitution is very strong in terms of making provision about equality before law, opportunity, non-discrimination. It banned untouchability in the fundamental right itself and make it a matter of punishment, which resulted into the Untouchability Offence Act of 1955 and later on Atrocity Act of 89. So on that front, on the front of the provision, I think the Constitution is fairly clear. But the problem is, which Dr. Ambedkar has right from the beginning mentioned, is this, that the difference between de jure and de facto. that when the objective resolution by Nehru was proposed for the constitution, at that very time, in the very beginning, he says that giving right is very important, but giving right is not enough. What you require is that a economic and social system which will ensure that the people are able to make use of that right, fundamental rights of equality, liberty, fraternity. And that is a point. In practice, you find a lot of contradiction. And that is why a bulk of the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe and part of OBC are not able to enjoy the equal right which is given in the constitution. And Dr. Ambedkar, if you recall, his constitution was state and minorities, wherein he basically tried to provide an economic and a social structure whereby people will be able to use the fundamental right of equality and liberty. So, for the constitution, for the democracy also, he argued for economic democracy and social democracy. To be able to use your economic right, he suggested that we should have some sort of a socialist pattern of society or socialism, whereby the means of productions are owned by the state, and you guarantee economic equality. That will enable the people to use it in the constitution. In terms of reservation in legislature, in public sector jobs, in education institutions. But nevertheless, what we see is that the reservation in jobs and education is confined to public sector. A vast private sector where 80% of jobs are in private sector is excluded from there. So he was aware about that. But as a larger solution, he accepted Buddhism. That if you want to change the norms and the values which decide the behavior of the high caste, then you have to have a religion as a morality, not as a religion in a traditional sense of having God and rituals and other thing, but religion as a principle of morality which will be supportive to the principle given in the constitution. So you can see that both in the economic system as well as in the social system, Dr. Ambedkar tried to give a systemic solution to enable the people to use the equality and freedom. And that is not there. That is why he was all the while frustrated. You know his remark in the Constitution, and if you see his latest remark on the BBC, people have discovered his interview, where he said that democracy will not succeed in this country. That is what precisely is happening now today. That is because the religion and the caste has taken over the democracy. So I think this is a major point that I would like to mention. Another point that Dr. Ambedkar emphasized, and I also feel that with all its limitation, what we have done during last 70 years is that we have provision in the constitution, we have reservation policy, we have other policy, but there is also civil right movement and general support, general feeling against the caste system. We are critical of inequality based on caste, we are critical of inequality based on religion and the gender, and there is a general movement. But from the last 30 years or 25 years, this movement and this perspective has been reversed. Now what you see, particularly after 2014, that people are precisely talking of a social system based on caste. People talk about constitution based on Manusmriti, constitution based on Sanatan principle, constitution based on Vedic principle. So this is something which is very shocking, because as against the 75-year general support to the principle of equality and general opposition to the caste system, what we now find is precisely the opposite. That we are now supporting the system which in fact brought the inequality in our social life. And that I think is very, very frustrating point. And as back as 1944 in Madras, Dr. Ambedkar has said that we are in the age of counter-revolution. And by counter-revolution he means that the ideology which is supportive of inequality, the ideology which is not supportive of so much of rationalism, is is becoming very aggressive. And the aggressiveness of this ideology you can see now very well, that there is no, people don't feel ashamed of talking, giving the base of Manusmriti, Rigveda, Sanatan Dharma to the constitution, and bringing even the Singal to the new parliament. Singal doesn't represent the principle in the constitution as such. Singal represents Shivaism, and Shivaism in generally support Brahmanical rituals and others, and also it doesn't is opposite to the caste system as such. You have to see that they own thousands of acres of land, and there are laborers who
We'll now have the translation, a quick one, sir. Yeah. And then Professor Danda.
ಪ್ರೊಫೆಸರ್ ಸುಖದೇವ್ ಥೋರಟ್ ಸರ್ ಅವರ ಮಾತುಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಆ್ಯಕ್ಚುಲಿ ಹಲವಾರು ಕಾನೂನುಗಳಿದೆ. ಅದರಲ್ಲಿ 1989ರ SC/ST ಆ್ಯಕ್ಟ್ಗಳಿರ್ಬೋದು ಮತ್ತು ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ಕಾನೂನುಗಳಿದೆ. ಹಕ್ಕುಗಳು ಕೊಡುವುದು ಅತ್ಯಂತ ಮಹತ್ವದಾಗಿದೆ. ಸಮಾನತೆಯನ್ನು ಆ್ಯಕ್ಚುಲಿ ಖಾತ್ರಿಪಡಿಸುವುದು SC/ST, OBC ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಮೈನಾರಿಟಿಗಳಿಗೆ ನಾಗರಿಕ ಯುದ್ಧ ಎನ್ನುವಂಥದ್ದು ಅದು ವಿತಿನ್ ನಡೆಯುವಂಥ ಇದು ಇದೆ. ಕೊನೆಯ ಒಂದು 20-30 ವರ್ಷದಿಂದ ಆ್ಯಕ್ಚುಲಿ ಈ ರೀತಿಯ ಬೆಳವಣಿಗೆಗಳನ್ನು ಕಾಣ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೇವೆ. ವಿಶೇಷವಾಗಿ 2014ರಿಂದ ಜಾತಿ, ಧರ್ಮ ಮತ್ತು ಮನುವಾದ ಎನ್ನುವಂಥ ಆಯಾಮ ಇಟ್ಕೊಂಡು ಕೋಮುವಾದಗಳನ್ನು ಸೃಷ್ಟಿಸ್ತಾ ಸುಮಾರು 75% ಜನ, 75% ಆಫ್ ಪಾಪ್ಯುಲೇಷನ್ ಏನಾಗಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಅಂದರೆ ಇದು ತಿಳಿದುಕೊಳ್ಳದೆ, ಇದು ಸರ್ವ ಜನರಿಗೂ ವಿಶೇಷವಾಗಿರ್ಬೇಕಂತ ಒಂದು ಸಂವಿಧಾನ ಇದೆ. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ 1944ರ ಮದ್ರಾಸ್ನಲ್ಲಿ ಅವರು ಬಾಬಾ ಸಾಹೇಬ್ ಅವರು ಪ್ರತಿತಂತ್ರ ಅಥವಾ ಪುನರ್ ಆಗಿರ್ಬೇಕಂತ ಒಂದು ವಾದ ಆಗ್ತದೆ. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಒಟ್ಟಾರೆ ಮನುಸ್ಮೃತಿ, ಸನಾತನ ಧರ್ಮ ಮತ್ತು ಶಿಲಾಂಗ್ ಅನ್ನೋಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದು ಇವತ್ತು ಪಾರ್ಲಿಮೆಂಟಲ್ಲಿರಬೇಕಂತ ರಾಷ್ಟ್ರೀಯ ಲಾಂಛನದಲ್ಲಿ ಶಿಲಾಂಗ್ ಅದು ಒಂದು ಶಿವಾಯಿಸಮ್ ಅನ್ನಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದನ್ನು ಪ್ರತಿಬಿಂಬಿಸ್ತದೆ. ಅದು ಬ್ರಾಹ್ಮಣ ವಾದವನ್ನ ಮತ್ತು ಸಂಪ್ರದಾಯವನ್ನ ಯಥಾಸ್ಥಿತಿ ವಾದವನ್ನ ಪ್ರತಿಬಿಂಬಿಸ್ತದೆ. ಇವೆಲ್ಲವುಗಳು ಬಹಳ ಏನಂತಾರಲ್ಲ ವೈರುಧ್ಯದಲ್ಲಿ ನಾವು ಇದ್ದೇವೆ. ಇದರ ಕುರಿತು ನಾವು ಅತ್ಯಂತ ಸ್ಪಷ್ಟವಾಗಿ ತಿಳಿದುಕೊಳ್ಬೇಕಾಗಿದೆ ಎನ್ನುವಂಥ ಮಾತುಗಳು ಹೇಳಿರ್ಬೇಕಂತ ಪ್ರೊಫೆಸರ್ ಸುಖದೇವ್ ಥೋರಾಟ್ ಸರ್ ಅವರಿಗೆ ನನ್ನ ಪರವಾಗಿ ಅಭಿನಂದನೆಗಳನ್ನು ಸಲ್ಲಿಸ್ತೇನೆ. ಧನ್ಯವಾದಗಳು.
I think I must begin by thanking all the audience for their patience. Can you hear me? Now? Fantastic, thank you. So I'm honored to participate in this panel with esteemed thinkers and to contribute some thoughts on what is at stake when we speak of ensuring equality. We are tired of empty promises of politicians, of crowd-pleasing rhetorical flourishes of Achhe Din, which are nowhere in sight. The hopes of the last century of self-improvement, innovation, and progress through a lessening of the unjust distributions of privileges inherited by citizens at the start of India's miraculous journey and towards building a social fabric of more equal relations seem to be slowly ebbing away. Even so, there is no cause for despair. Right, is it better? Okay, thank you. For there is a resurgence of demand for justice emerging from experienced inequalities and inspired by constitutional values which this conference strikingly exemplifies. The underprivileged are reeling from the silence of the caretakers of the state. When houses are bulldozed, when public land is cunningly sold to corporate profiteers, when farmers and laborers who produce food that nurtures the people are given false promises, when academics and activists risking their safety to call out these invasions of responsibility are put behind bars. The silence of the caretakers of the state is astounding. Equality before the law is surreptitiously undermined. Is a small illegal construction more illegal than a housing complex made on stealthily obtained land by a conglomerate? When the tea stall is bulldozed, the superficial reasoning given is that the illegal construction deserved to be demolished. But this is only a cover for what everyone knows is the operative or causative reason that the tea shop belonging to the other, the Muslim, is as dispensable as its hapless owner. The calculatedly averted gaze of government officials allows a selective use of the coercive state apparatus. Bulldozers for some, regularization for others. In such an atmosphere of the sectarian use of the law, how can anyone expect to ensure equality in the eyes of the law? Who will ensure equality? Seen from the ground up, from the lowest point of the powerlessness of citizens in the face of such silence and evasion of responsibility of the caretakers of the state, there are many examples. Consider Dr. Umar Khalid, PhD, a student activist whose hearing for a bail has been postponed 13 times. He was arrested under UAPA for allegedly causing disturbance, abusive behavior passed without punishment. It could easily be argued that not strictly censoring such vicious speech is implicitly inciting anti-Muslim hatred and potentially encouraging others to repeat such hate speech. Just as silence on domestic violence against women and children in one home begets similar violence elsewhere. The chain of culpability is engineered in one case and deliberately broken in the other. So who will ensure equality? When systems of accountability, of codependent responsibility for institutional failures are weak or even absent, no one seems to be in charge to protect the seriously at risk life and safety of the underprivileged. Surely, it is not sufficient to espouse ideals of equality, necessary though they are. It is equally necessary to ensure that there must be robust systems of accountability, systems that will allow routinely and methodically to address failures of duty of care, such as in the multiple cases of harassment leading to suicides of Dalit students in elite educational institutions. Not ensuring equity can deteriorate into situations of such severe state neglect that atrocities committed in a frenzy of lawlessness is all it takes to permanently disfigure the social fabric, as witnessed currently in Manipur. However, the grievous form of inequality before the law could be reduced if laws such as the UAPA were removed from the statute book. That is something concrete this conference must demand, in my humble view. But I also want to stress that waiting for systems to change or for constitutional values to be re-energized may take too long. Even as an elaborate set of laws designed to uphold the constitutional values of equality and equity exists, the vigilance in asserting one's rights and doing one's duty has sadly waned over the last few decades. One can say of the upwardly mobile middle classes, once drunk on the pleasurable consumption of newly acquired consumer goods, and now slowly facing stagnation, unemployability, and perhaps even decline, that they did not think of their duty as active citizens to create an ethos of respect for the values of citizenship. Fraternity or Maitri or political friendship that Baba Sahib led us to appreciate is a deep value. Maitri is not achievable by sleepwalking through one's privileges. In that case, the so-called modern life did not have the capacity to overturn the egregious system of inequality that is casteism, entrenched over centuries. People live sequestered lives guarding their caste privileges. Only the sharpest of self-scrutiny of one's gains from exploiting the unequal position of fellow citizens can bring us closer to Maitri. Little around us encourages this self-scrutiny. I think the Bharat Jodo Yatra did play a small role in energizing this sense of citizens' duty to learn from others, not immediately in one's habitat, people speaking different languages from other states, from other classes and castes. But the destructive forces on the other side, who do not espouse equal dignity in any form or shape, even for their own followers, let alone the 14% of the population they want to disown as their fellow citizens, have created a disgusting malaise. The moneyed and the powerful feel entitled to even more privileges and ride roughshod over the rights of others. The image I have in mind is of the belligerent young woman in a fancy car, stalled in traffic due to the farmers' protests, showing the middle fingers of her both hands to an elderly farmer who was patiently explaining to her and trying to calm her down by calling her puttar, child. And another image is of a party workers opposed to the farmers' protest shouting Khalistani to a serving police officer doing his duty at the site. Religious abuse has become a ready tool both to frighten the other and to buttress one's loyalty to the ruling party. So, to ensure equality, change seekers cannot wait for systems to change. They must become the change, transforming themselves for the common good. To learn what it feels like to be treated without equal dignity, it is crucial to listen to those who have suffered inequality all their lives. For the privileged, being a woman and having first-hand experience of equal treatment vis-a-vis men is not enough to sensitize one to the indignities of casteism that casteism heaps on people. Even the strength of passionate commitment that comes from the place of experiencing inequality as a woman is not enough to envisage a path out of casteism to a future of truly equal dignity. Our Dalit, Bahujan and our Adivasi sisters and brothers must be the leaders who show the way to ensure equality. The caste and class biases of political leadership has cramped the imagination of conceptions of equality for far too long. The privileged must follow and assist the true knowledge bearers as best as their fractured selves will allow. Finally, to give a fair chance at success to such a leadership in making a root and branch transformation from inequality to equity, systemic political and social changes would be needed. First, an atmosphere of fearless inquiry and criticism must be ensured, for which it is key to repeal draconian laws like the UAPA. Second, the diversity of ideological points of view must have a place, for which proportional representation as a system of electing representatives is crucial. Third, are the enabling conditions, socioeconomic measures such as progressive taxation, strengthening of social security measures, making quality health care available from public money on a needs basis. In short, halting the headlong drive into privatization that has plunged the country in unprecedented levels of inequality. Finally, constitutionally guaranteed support for forms of respectful collective living, be they guided by diverse sexual preferences or minority religious attachments, must be a key component of an inviolable right to equality. With these measures in place, there would be some hope of definite steps towards ensuring equality and equity. Thank you.
We'll have a quick translation of that.
ಪ್ರೊಫೆಸರ್ ಮೀನಾ ಅವರು ಸಮಾನತೆ ಸಮಪಾಲು ಖಾತ್ರಿಪಡಿಸುವುದು ಹೇಗೆ, ಸಂವಿಧಾನದ ಮೌಲ್ಯಗಳೇನು, ರೈತರು, ಕಾರ್ಮಿಕರು ಮತ್ತು ಹೋರಾಟ ಮಾಡುವವರು, ವಿದ್ವಾಂಸರಿಗೆ ಇದೊಂದು ಏನಂತ ಚಾಲೆಂಜ್ ಆಗಿದೆ ಅನ್ನುವಕ್ಕಂತ ಮಾತು ಹೇಳಿದ್ರು. ಅನ್ಯಾಯದ ವಿರುದ್ಧವಾಗಿ ಯಾವುದೇ ವಿಷಯಗಳಿದ್ರೂ ನಾವು ಅದನ್ನು ಫೇಸ್ ಮಾಡಬೇಕು. ಪ್ರೊಫೆಸರ್ ಡಾಕ್ಟರ್ ಖಾಲಿದ್ ಉಮರ್ ಅವರ ಸುಮಾರು 30 ಬೇಲ್ಗಳಿಗೆ ಪ್ರಯತ್ನ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು, ಸಿಗಲಿಲ್ಲ ಅನ್ನುವಕ್ಕಂಥ ಮಾತುಗಳನ್ನು ಆಡಿದರು. ಇದರಲ್ಲಿ ವಿಶೇಷವಾಗಿ ಮಹಿಳೆಯರಿಗೆ ಅವಕಾಶಗಳು ಕೊಡಬೇಕು ಅನ್ನುವಕ್ಕಂಥ ಮಾತುಗಳನ್ನು ಫೋಕಸ್ ಮಾಡಿದರು. ಯಾರು ಸಮಾನತೆ ಸಮಪಾಲು ಕೊಡೋದು ಸಾಧ್ಯವಿಲ್ಲ, ಸಾಂಸ್ಥಿಕ ಮೌಲ್ಯಗಳು ಆ್ಯಕ್ಚುಲಿ ವಿಫಲವಾಗ್ತವೆ ಅನ್ನುವಕ್ಕಂಥ ಮಾತುಗಳನ್ನು ವ್ಯಕ್ತಪಡಿಸಿದರು. ವಿಶೇಷವಾಗಿ ದಲಿತ ವಿದ್ಯಾರ್ಥಿಗಳು ಅತ್ಯಂತ ಮಣಿಪೂರಿನ ಒಂದು ಪ್ರಕರಣ ಕೂಡ ಅವರು ಫೋಕಸ್ ಮಾಡಿದರು. ಈ ಸಮ್ಮೇಳನದ ಆಶಯ ಏನಾಗಬೇಕು ಅನ್ನುವುದಂದರೆ ಆ ನಿರುದ್ಯೋಗ ಆ್ಯಕ್ಚುಲಿ ಬಹಳಷ್ಟು ಸಮಸ್ಯೆಗಳಿಂದ ಕೂಡಿದೆ. ಅದು ಭಾತೃತ್ವ ಭಾವನೆ ಬರಬೇಕು. ಆಧುನಿಕ ಜೀವನದಲ್ಲಿ ಸಂವಿಧಾನದ ಮೌಲ್ಯಗಳನ್ನು ಅಳವಡಿಸಿಕೊಳ್ಳುವುದರ ಮೂಲಕ ನಾವು ಸಂವಿಧಾನದ ಆಶಯಗಳನ್ನು ಪೂರೈಸಬೇಕು ಅನ್ನುವಂಥ ಮಾತುಗಳನ್ನು ಆಡಿದರು. ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಖಾಲಿಸ್ತಾನ ಮತ್ತು ಧಾರ್ಮಿಕ ಒಂದು ಅಭಿಮಿನಿಂದ ಕೂಡಿದೆ ಅನ್ನುವಂಥ ಮಾತುಗಳನ್ನು ಹೇಳಿದರು. ವ್ಯವಸ್ಥೆಯ ಬದಲಾವಣೆಗಿಂತ ನಾವು ಸ್ವಯಂ ಬದಲಾವಣೆ ಆಗುವುದು ಅಗತ್ಯ. ಮಹಿಳೆಯರಿಗೆ ಸಮಾನತೆ ಕೊಡುವುದು ಅಷ್ಟೇ ಅಗತ್ಯ ಇದೆ. ದಲಿತರು, ಬಹುಜನರು, ಆದಿವಾಸಿಗಳು ನಾಯಕರು ಅವಶ್ಯಕತೆ ಇದೆ, ನಾಯಕರ ರೂಪಿಸುವುದು ಅವಶ್ಯಕತೆ ಇದೆ. ಸಮಾನತೆ ಮತ್ತು ಸ್ವಾತಂತ್ರ್ಯ, ಭಾತೃತ್ವ ಮತ್ತು ಸಾಮಾಜಿಕ ನ್ಯಾಯ ವನ್ನು ರೂಪಿಸುವಲ್ಲಿ ಅಥವಾ ಅದನ್ನು ಪೂರ್ಣಗೊಳಿಸುವಲ್ಲಿ ಸಂವಿಧಾನ ಅತ್ಯಂತ ಅಗತ್ಯ ಎನ್ನುವಂಥ ಮಾತುಗಳನ್ನು ಆಡಿರುವಂಥ ಮೇಡಮ್ ಅವರಿಗೆ ಧನ್ಯವಾದಗಳು. ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ.
Okay, we have time for one question. If anybody has a question. Okay, we'll go with sir. Okay, sorry. Okay, anybody else who has a question? Okay, there. I spotted them first, so yeah.
Who, ma'am?
Please also let us know if the question is directed to any particular member.
Yes, it is to Professor Dhannath. I really enjoyed your talk. I just have one question. You talked about leadership roles of the Bahujan, and I completely agree with that. Can you also shed more light on how do you see that happening, in which spheres of life, and how do we even start thinking about that process where people who are already in those positions from historic privilege will just give that up under even ethical or moral consideration or guilt even? How do you think we can start that conversation? Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yeah, very briefly. I already know, sitting in this hall, a number of people who could make great leaders. And they are journalists. I can name them if you like. I know them personally. And there are others who potentially could be leaders. There are some who already are political representatives. So it's not that there is a dearth of people. There is definitely the lack of financial and other support for them. I mean, we have great journalists, like, for example, the Muknaik. They don't have money to run things. You know, they are reporting from the ground and they don't have the money to run their establishment. So it's just that the money that is going towards changing whatever party system you want to change should go to the right people, is a very small suggestion that I have. And I think the people are there.
Okay, thank you. Okay. So you can take the question later. You can ask it later. We have to close the discussion now. Yeah. Okay. So with that we come to an end of the discussion, and I think the overbearing lesson that we got today was that no matter how many obstacles come our way, we march on and try to ensure equity and equality, and try and make sure that the Constitution, as intended, keeps working to ensure equality and equity. Yeah. Thank you.
May I request everyone to settle down so we can begin the session? Can you please settle down so we can begin? Yeah, good evening and welcome to this session, which is on the question of holding together India's federalism. I am Rinal Satish. I'm a professor at the National Law School and I'll be the moderator of this session. It's my pleasure to introduce the 4 speakers that we have for this session. Professor Govind Rao, who's an emeritus professor at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy and a member of the, was a member of the 14th Finance Commission. Professor Kam Khan Swan Housing, who's a professor and former head of the Department of Political Science at the University of Hyderabad. Professor Ashutosh Vashni, the director of the Saxena Center for Contemporary South Asia, Saul Goldman Professor of International Studies and Social Sciences, and Professor Yamini Iyer, President and Chief Executive of the Center for Policy Research. So each speaker will have 10 minutes and so we'll spend 40 minutes with all your remarks. So Professor Rao, over to you first. Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone, and let me at the outset thank Dr. Krishnaswamy for asking me, Dr. Krishnaswamy to be asking me to speak on the issues of federalism this afternoon. The Constitution describes India as a union of states. In fact, you do not find the word federalism anywhere. And possibly when you are talking about university, they try to to accommodate diversity along with unity. You know, there is a lot of unity, but at the same time they wanted to accommodate diversity with a considerable amount of decentralization sort of built into the constitution scheme of things. And as we progressed on the public sector dominated, heavy industry based import substituting industrialization strategy, the cooperation between the union and state became imperative. So there was a lot of cliche that was said that, oh, there is a lot of cooperative federalism, we should have cooperative federalism. Indeed, we should have, but the question is, do we have cooperative federalism in the system, or do we have competition for the same fiscal or other natural resources space between the union and the states and among the states inter se? So there is a lot of work that has, in fact the first generation theories of federalism basically talk about cooperative federalism. It's basically based on the idea that you have a benevolent state, a social guardian, and then welfare of the economy will be improved by cooperation. Basically that's the idea. But the fact of the matter is there is very little of cooperation you can see, and particularly after in fact when you have a planned development strategy, in fact centralized planning is a negation of federalism. So after the planning, after 1991 particularly, both the role of the states as well as the role of the market has substantially changed, and so obviously the holding together federalism that you had as against the coming together federalism, which in most of the federations that you have, has had a very heavy centripetal bias, and for want of time I will not go into the details of the centripetal bias. But now, having gone through all these, now, sort of economy, in fact, we have taken the shackles, we try to give more role to the market, and then obviously economy has started, growing faster. Now, so much so that the Prime Minister now says that we should have Viksit Bharat in in the centenary year, which basically means that India will have to grow at the rate of 9% per year. Because for the World Bank, according to the World Bank definition, a developed country is the one with $13,205 per capita income. India's per capita income is $2,600, which means that in the next 25 years you have to multiply 5 times. And well, that would require a hell of a lot of reforms to be done. And in the meantime, there is a lot of competition for resources between the union and the state, and we have seen a lot of discussion political discussion that is taking place. In the system that we have, in the constitution that we have, there is you have the 7th schedule, and in the 7th schedule there is considerable amount of overlapping. And not only that there is overlapping, there is a possibility of the union government taking over the state subjects and the concurrent subjects. In fact, in the 14th Finance Commission, we found that the union government spending on the state subjects had increased from 13% from 2005 to 2012, from 13% to 17%. Now, which basically means union government gets through to the state subject through what is called the centrally sponsored schemes. Now, there are many other ways. It's not just that. In this particular overlapping assignment system, there is no, in fact, in this overlapping assignment system, we do not have, and then when there is so much of a competition between the units, we do not have, do not have an institution for intergovernmental coordination, intergovernmental bargaining, and conflict resolution. This is one of the major problems that we have in the Indian Federation, and in fact, this was pointed out in the Administrative Reforms Commission, first Administrative Reforms Commission, pointed out in the Sarkaria Commission, but nevertheless, even then, they said that you should have an institution, and they created an institution and put it within the Union Home Ministry. So obviously, the institution within the Union Home Ministry is not the one which will create an impartial system. Then you have the whole issue of sharing of resources through the Finance Commission, and now Finance Commissions have a lot of difficulties, and today we have a situation where the fiscal deficit of the country is almost, something like 9% of GDP. Basically, they will have to come and share the deficits. And that's one of the major issues, and how they are going to do will have to be seen. And so you do have many problems. One of the major problems is a lack of institution for intergovernmental bargaining and conflict resolution, which is going to be a major issue in the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rao. May I request Professor Singh to... So, I think first we have a translation. My apologies.
ಪ್ರೊಫೆಸರ್ ರಾವ್ ಅವರು ಭಾರತದ ಒಕ್ಕೂಟ ವ್ಯವಸ್ಥೆಯ ಸುಧಾರಣೆಯ ಆಯಾಮಗಳ ಕುರಿತು ಬಹಳ ಸವಿಸ್ತಾರವಾಗಿ ಮಾತಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ರಾಜ್ಯ ಕೇಂದ್ರಗಳ ನಡುವಿನ ಸಂಬಂಧಗಳು, ಆರ್ಥಿಕ ಬೆಳವಣಿಗೆ, ಕೈಗಾರಿಕಾ ಸಹಕಾರಗಳು, ಮಾರುಕಟ್ಟೆ ವ್ಯವಸ್ಥೆ, ಭಾರತದ GDPಯ ಕುರಿತು ಮಾತನಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ವರ್ಲ್ಡ್ ಬ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ರಿಪೋರ್ಟ್ ಕೂಡ ಎಷ್ಟು ಡಾಲರ್ ಇದೆ, ಭಾರತದ್ದು $260 ಇದೆ, ಇದು 25 ವರ್ಷಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ದ್ವಿಗುಣಗೊಳ್ಳಬೇಕೆನ್ನುವಂತ ಮಾತುಗಳನ್ನು ಆಡಿದ್ರು. ಸಹಕಾರ ಒಕ್ಕೂಟ ಮತ್ತು ಸ್ಪರ್ಧಾತ್ಮಕ ಒಕ್ಕೂಟ ಕೇಂದ್ರ ರಾಜ್ಯಗಳ ಮಧ್ಯೆ ನಡೆಯುತ್ತಿದೆ. ಸಹಕಾರವಿಲ್ಲದೆ ಸ್ಪರ್ಧೆ ಅದು ಎಡವಟ್ಟಿಗೆ ಕಾರಣ ಆಗ್ತದೆ. ಇದರಿಂದ ಸಂಘರ್ಷಗಳು ಉಂಟು ಮಾಡದ ಪ್ರಥಮವಾಗಿ ಪ್ರಥಮ ಆಡಳಿತ ಆಯೋಗ ಭಾರತದ ಗೃಹ ಇಲಾಖೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಅಳವಡಿಸಿ ಆಕ್ಚುಲಿ ಹಣಕಾಸು ಆಯಾಮದ GDPಗಳನ್ನ ಅಥವಾ ಪ್ರಮುಖವಾಗಿ ಈ ಆರ್ಥಿಕ ಸಮಸ್ಯೆಗಳು ಕೇಂದ್ರ ಮತ್ತು ರಾಜ್ಯ ನಡುವೆ ತಲ್ಲಣಗೊಳ್ತಾ ಇದೆ. ಇದನ್ನು ಸರಿಪಡಿಸಿದಾಗ ಸಂವಿಧಾನದ ಆಶಯ ಪೂರಕಗೊಳ್ಳುತ್ತದೆ ಎನ್ನುವಂತ ಹೋಲ್ ಮಾತಿನ ಅರ್ಥವನ್ನು ಆಡಿದ ಪ್ರೊಫೆಸರ್ ರಾವ್ ಅವರಿಗೆ ಧನ್ಯವಾದಗಳು. ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Chair, and I'm particularly grateful to NLS and the Government of Karnataka for this signal honor and for this opportunity. So what I intend to flag today is one of the operative instruments of holding together federalism, which is asymmetric federalism, on which I had worked for quite some time now. And what I intend to do is to flag the centrality of asymmetric federalism in holding together India's deep diversity. The acknowledgement and acceptance of deep diversity, which in effect are territorially mobilized, and in effect become consequential at the time of, or at the founding moment of India's Federal Republic, precisely because there had been disparate set of territories which had long-standing sovereign and semi-sovereign political experience. And how did the Indian nation state, as it were, negotiate with these pre-existing political entities with distinctive historical experience? What was the oath of having a centralized federation or a union of state which was otherwise not sensitive to deep diversities? To my mind, I think asymmetric federalism, to the extent that it is based on normative as well as institutional foundation of recognizing and accommodating deep diversity, is consequential to holding together especially tribal groups in Northeast India, which had not been integral to India's freedom movement. I have in mind the Nagas, which a large part of the Naga tribal areas, which was excluded and therefore outside the remit of pan-Indian legislation, as well as a large part of India's freedom movement, and also several tribal groups in the erstwhile hill areas of Assam, which in effect had autonomous political experience under different chieftaincy. And the odds of integrating these, or as it were, providing accommodative institution fulcrum through the provision of asymmetric federalism, I think is consequential and central in ensuring that Indian state not only consolidate but also ensures that there is a democracy deepening in the peripheral regions of Northeast India. And I think this is where asymmetric federalism has to be seen as a multi-level interaction system, not only between the center and the state, but also between the state, that is the subnational unit, and the local units, as it were. Because looking at the very founding institutions which envision asymmetric institution in the form of 6th schedule, and subsequently the formation of Nagaland under Article 371A, subsequently Article 371Z in Mizoram, in effect ensures that asymmetric, you look at closely the experience of Nagaland, for example, between 2010 and 2013, when with the rise of a regionalist political party called the Nagaland or the Naga People's Front, you have a regionalist space which seeks to claim and contend that this negotiated sovereignty in effect envisions that Naga Legislative Assembly has the exclusive sovereign rights to regulate, for example, on the control and exploitation of natural gas as well as petroleum. The union government initially, in effect, responded in the affirmative, but subsequently recanted, and there was a lot of, back as well as back channel negotiation, which eventually subside the matter, and the matter is now put in the back burner. We do not know when it would re-emerge again. But what is important, therefore, is that this type of regionalist or autonomous assertion in some of these regionalist space like Nagaland, in effect, also reinforce that asymmetric institutions have to be sensitive to the internal dynamics within Nagaland, given that land and resources which in effect embodied which in effect underpinned the fluid flow of natural gas and oil, for example, are co-owned or co-shared. How do you then fix which particular tribal customary laws prevailed in determining or adjudicating, for example, intertribal customary laws. And that is precisely where the negotiated as well as shared dimension of self-rule in effect becomes particularly pertinent in the context of the center-state interactive relational dynamics, which the case of Nagaland has in effect explicated. Looking down how the state and the sub-state level in effect interact within this rubric of asymmetric federal institution, the clearest evidence of which is the recent scale of violence that we witnessed in Manipur since 3rd May 2023, which in effect reinforced the imperative to think of, for example, how constellation of actors at the state and the sub-state level and the rise of majoritarianism in effect implicate on institutional working as well as political process. And when you have an ideological loaded political party formation which is not sensitive to, which seeks to sidestep sub-state constitutional asymmetry, especially on issues pertaining to ownership of tribal land and resources, you can have a very antagonistic state sub-state level interaction. And that is precisely where minorities which are concentrated at the sub-state level can be in effect castigated with all sorts of name-calling, xenophobic attack and attempt to annihilate, as it were, in the words of Pramod Singh, one of the influential leader, social cultural organization in Manipur. So this is where I think asymmetric federalism therefore has to be seen as it promotes the cause of democracy by giving voice and agency to the territorially concentrated minorities, but also allowing sub-state minorities within that particular territorial frame to also have equally effective voice and agency in determining not only institutional arrangement, but also in political process and policy outcomes, I think are imperative for us to think at how these, making these asymmetric institutions work for the last 75 years, in effect have begged us to think and revisit some of the promise as well as limitation which are embedded in the idea and practice of asymmetric federalism. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. I request the translation.
ಖಾನ್ ಹೌಸಿಂಗ್ ಅವರು ಕರ್ನಾಟಕ ಸರ್ಕಾರಕ್ಕೆ ಮೊದಲಿಗೆ ಧನ್ಯವಾದಗಳನ್ನು ಹೇಳುತ್ತಾ ಅಸಮಾನತೆ ಒಕ್ಕೂಟ ವ್ಯವಸ್ಥೆಯ ಕುರಿತು ಮಾತನಾಡ್ತಾರೆ. ಕೇಂದ್ರ ಸರ್ಕಾರದ ಸಾಂಸ್ಥಿಕ ವ್ಯವಸ್ಥೆಗಳು ನಾರ್ತ್ ಈಸ್ಟ್ ರಾಜ್ಯಗಳು, ಪೂರ್ವ ಪಶ್ಚಿಮ ರಾಜ್ಯಗಳಿಗೆ ಇವತ್ತಿಗೆ ಆದಿವಾಸಿಗಳಿಗೆ ಮತ್ತು ಪ್ರಜಾಪ್ರಭುತ್ವ ವ್ಯವಸ್ಥೆಗೆ ಒಕ್ಕೂಟ ವ್ಯವಸ್ಥೆಗೆ ಹೇಗೆ ಒಂದು ಸಂಘರ್ಷ ನಡೆದಿದೆ ಎನ್ನುವಕ್ಕಂಥ ಮಾತುಗಳನ್ನು ಆಡಿದ್ರು. ಕೇಂದ್ರ ರಾಜ್ಯ ಸರ್ಕಾರ ಆಕ್ಚುಲಿ ಅಷ್ಟೇ ಅಲ್ಲದೆ ರಾಜ್ಯ ಮತ್ತು ಸ್ಥಳೀಯವಾಗಿ ಕೂಡ ಅವಕಾಶಗಳು ಒದಗಿಸಬೇಕು. ನಾಗಾಲ್ಯಾಂಡ್ ಪ್ರಾಂತಿಕ ಸಮಸ್ಯೆ ಅಷ್ಟೇ ಅಲ್ಲದೆ ನಾಗಾಲ್ಯಾಂಡ್ ರಾಜ್ಯದ ಅಸಮಾನತೆಗಳಿಗೆ ರಾಜ್ಯ ಮತ್ತು ಕೇಂದ್ರದ ಸಮಸ್ಯೆಗಳೇನಿದೆ ಅನ್ನುವಂಥದ್ದು, ವಿಶೇಷವಾಗಿ ಆದಿವಾಸಿಗಳು ಕೇಂದ್ರ ರಾಜ್ಯ ಸರ್ಕಾರಗಳಿಗೆ ಸಂಬಂಧಗಳ ಕುರಿತು ಮಾತಾಡಿದ್ರು. 2023ರ ಮಣಿಪುರ ಸಮಸ್ಯೆಗಳು, ರಾಜಕೀಯ ಸಮಸ್ಯೆಗಳು ಹೇಗೆ ಪರಿಣಾಮಕಾರಿಯಾಗಿ ಸಾಂಸ್ಥಿಕವಾಗಿರಬೇಕಂತ ಬದಲಾವಣೆಗಳು ತರಲು ಪ್ರಯತ್ನಿಸುತ್ತೇವೆ ಅನ್ನೋಕಂತ ಮಾತುಗಳನ್ನು ಆಡಿದ್ರು. ಕೊನೆಯದಾಗಿ ಅವರು ಬಹಳ ಇಂಪಾರ್ಟೆಂಟ್ ಮಹತ್ವ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದು, ಪ್ರಜಾಪ್ರಭುತ್ವ ಒಕ್ಕೂಟ ವ್ಯವಸ್ಥೆ ಒಂದು ದೇಹಕ್ಕೆ ಹೇಗೆ ಹೃದಯ ಮಹತ್ವ ಇದೆಯೋ ಹಾಗಿದೆ. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಆ ಹೃದಯವನ್ನ ಸಾಂಸ್ಥಿಕ ಸಂಸ್ಥೆಗಳ ಮೂಲಕ ಸಂವಿಧಾನದ ಒಕ್ಕೂಟ ವ್ಯವಸ್ಥೆ ಭದ್ರಪಡಿಸಿ ರಾಜ್ಯಗಳಿಗೆ ಒಂದು ಸಮತಾವಾದ ಅರ್ಪಿಸಿದರೆ ತುಂಬಾ ಅನುಕೂಲ ಆಗ್ತದೆ ಅನ್ನೋಕ್ಕಂತ ಮಾತುಗಳನ್ನು ಆಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅವರಿಗೆ ಪ್ರೀತಿಪೂರ್ವಕ ಅಭಿನಂದನೆಗಳು. ಧನ್ಯವಾದಗಳು ಸರ್.
ಥ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಯು. ವಾಶ್ನಿ.
Thank you to the National Law School and Government of Karnataka. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? I see. Okay. Thanks to National Law School and Government of Karnataka for inviting me all the way from Boston. And I think Professor Krishnaswamy put me on this panel because he knew of a paper I published on federalism some years ago. So I have slides. I just find it easier to both give a more focused presentation as well as get your focus if I present my arguments in slides. So here we go. Basically, the attempt is to connect Indian federalism to how Indian nationalism or ideas about Indian nations, Indian national polity emerged. This is how it's structured. So most of the discussion on federalism is about, historically, traditionally, about constitutional division of powers and fiscal matters. And Professor Govinda Rao is here, our leading economist on fiscal federalism, and how exactly the powers were divided has attracted a lot of attention, but it's not normally noticed that the design of Indian federalism has a lot to do with the concept of nationhood that India's freedom movement believed in and propagated. Led by Mahatma Gandhi, the freedom movement fundamentally challenged the dominant concepts of nationhood in the late 19th and early 20th century. I'll briefly summarize them for you. And basically the idea at the turn of the century, in political theory it's born in 1860s, 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, is that every language group will have its own nation. One language, one nation. That's the European idea. It begins with, as so many things in modern political theory begin with John Stuart Mill. So John Stuart Mill, in his great text, Representative Government, 1869, wrote, linguistic diversity was a, quote, special, virtually insuperable hindrance to nation making, unquote. This is about the improbability of Indian nationhood. Improbability of nationhood, yeah, I can see that, but it's fine, yeah. Now, Mill's ideas, as we know, were not simply philosophical. He was a leading political philosopher of his time and father of modern liberalism. But it also penetrated the highest levels of decision making, both in London and the British establishment in India, based at that time in Kolkata. Here is one of the leading decision makers for some time, also the acting viceroy, and certainly the Governor General, acting Governor General for some time, but Lieutenant Governor of Northwest Frontier Province, and I've spent a lot of time in Bengal. Here is John Strachey. There is not and never was an India or even any country of India possessing, according to any European ideas, any sort of unity, physical, political, social or religious, and that men of the Punjab, Bengal, northwestern provinces and Madras should ever feel that they belong to one Indian nation is impossible. You might with as much reason and probability look forward to a time when a single nation will have taken the place of the various nations of Europe, unquote. This is actually a profound idea. This is not a cheap dismissal of the possibility of nationhood in India. This is basically saying that India, like Europe, is a civilization, a cultural construct. And Europe has 20-odd nations. Similarly, India, whenever we leave, the Brits leave, will be 27, 28 nations. Because there are so many languages here. So, and if you think of the best definition of the nation or a nationhood or nationalism, that has been provided by scholars, the best one is, I did not put any music into this presentation. It's coming from somewhere, from outside, okay. Okay, so Ernest Gellner has the best definition, that building a nation Building a nation is like putting a political roof over your cultural head. It's the best definition we know. It also says that the nation is not simply a cultural construct, which a civilization is. Nation is a political construct, or it merges the political and the culture. Gandhi challenges this. Gandhi basically delinks language and nationhood, which he calls a European idea. And this part of Gandhi is not being studied a lot, but you can find it. Gandhi is a maniacal writer. 99 volumes have already been published. Another 10 volumes could be published also, which are in the possession of his family, and they're working on it. So, making of India as a nation, he realized India was a civilization clearly, but India could also be made into a nation. And the making of India as a nation did not require the erasure of India's linguistic diversities in a European way. Famously, France, at the time of the French Revolution in France, only 12% spoke French. This is very well documented. It took another 100 years for the peasants in the Basque country, or peasants in Brittany to be taught French, and they started speaking French then, right? So the diversities of what we call France today were erased over a 100-year period. That's a classic historical example of how a nation was made in the 19th century. Okay, Gandhi basically said that we will, what we would call today, in today's language, today's political theory, hyphenate Indian identity. Indians will be Tamil Indians, Malayali Indians, Bengali Indians, Punjabi Indians, so on and so forth. It does not require, becoming an Indian does not require erasing the Bengaliness in you or erasing the Kannadiga in you. And the decisive political move that he makes is that Congress party, after he takes over, 1919, 1920, is not organized, its provincial units are not organized around the British units. There is no Bengal Presidency Congress, there is a Bengal Congress. There is no Madras Presidency Congress, there is a Tamil Congress, there is a Telugu Congress, there is a Malayali Congress. There is a Gujarat Congress, which represents all of some 100 odd Gujarati princely states, or 80 odd, something like that, small little states in Gujarat. So the claim was that the freedom movement will create a political roof over India's multilinguistic head. Linguistic erasure was not necessary. We will create a new non-European nation with hyphenated identities. Now, Sudhir said 2 hours back that Constitution is incomplete, and a lot of the work after 1950 about laws was done by politics. The Indian Constitution does not mention linguistic states. It does mention states, and does mention that there will be division of powers and between center and states. The idea of linguistic reorganization of state is basically a resurgence of Gandhian notion of nationhood. It goes back to the 1919-1920 political move, transforming the Congress party into its linguistic units. That's how Congress party was reformed. Okay. Now, in the last 2 minutes, let's now jump to the latest version of federalism theory and how it's connected. So Alfred Stepan and Juan Linz have come up with a very interesting typology around federalism and the relationship between federalism and nationhood. So they say you can think of the current national entities in the world as consisting of 3 kinds of states. Only 2 I'll be able to discuss, not the third. Nation state, multicultural states, and state nations. And they included in their book India, Canada, Spain as examples of state nations, which are different from nation states. A typical nation state is France, which erased its diversities and created a unimodal French person, a unimodal French person who is not even allowed to register his or her ethnicity or race. That's illegal. That's not, it's a crime. So this is how unimodal France became a classic nation state. State nations, and Professor Govinda Rao mentioned this point of the Constitution. State nations simultaneously safeguard diversity and promote all national level loyalties. And the idea that Bengaliness is promoted or Tamilness is promoted is not equal to saying that India is de-promoted or de-emphasized. You can do both together. That's the 1919-1920 Gandhi idea, which became part of the freedom movement, which became part of the Congress Party's ideology of the time. So what India is, according to this theory, is it's a state nation. It is a type of, that's a national entity, but state nation. And further, the final point of this theory was that if you apply nation-state policies and nation-state institutional designs on state nations, only suffering and unrest will result. These territorially concentrated diversities cannot be hammered into uniformity by state-nation policies. That will only lead to suffering. And then they give examples and they compare how India has dealt with its Tamil population and how Sri Lanka dealt with its Tamil population. And Indian Tamil aspirations were absorbed in a federal setup, the argument is, and DMK came to power in 1967, which represented Tamil separation at the time. And Sri Lanka never allowed its territorially concentrated Tamil minority in the north federalism. Never. It did not allow federalism, and instead it came up with a policy called Sinhala only policy as early as 1956, which is the beginning of the great Tamil Sinhala diversion in Sri Lanka's polity, and that led to finally a civil war, and still is an unresolved question. So that's it. That's what I have to say. Basically, the idea, there are all these the data here, but basically I wanted to make rather than database a conceptual argument that India should be, as a national entity, India is not a nation state. India is a state nation, and if Delhi starts applying nation state policies, it will only lead to suffering and disaster. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Vashni. May I request translation?
ಪ್ರೊಫೆಸರ್ ಅಸ್ತೋಷ್ ಅವರು ಐತಿಹಾಸಿಕ ರಾಷ್ಟ್ರೀಯತೆ ಸಿದ್ಧಾಂತಗಳನ್ನು ಕುರಿತು ಒಕ್ಕೂಟ ವ್ಯವಸ್ಥೆಯನ್ನ ಬಹಳ ಸ್ವಾರಸ್ಯಕರವಾಗಿ ವಿಶ್ಲೇಷಿಸಿದ್ರು. ವಿಶೇಷವಾಗಿ ಮಹಾತ್ಮ ಗಾಂಧೀಜಿಯವರ 19ನೇ ಮತ್ತು 20ನೇ ಶತಮಾನದಲ್ಲಿ ರಾಷ್ಟ್ರೀಯತೆಯ ವ್ಯಾಖ್ಯಾನವನ್ನ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರು. ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಜಾನ್ ಸ್ಟುವರ್ಟ್ ಮಿಲ್ ಅವರ ಭಾಷಾ ಆಧಾರದ ಕುರಿತು ಅವರ ಆಲೋಚನೆಗಳನ್ನ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಪಡಿಸಿದ್ರು. ಭಾರತದ ವಿವಿಧ ಭಾಷೆಗಳ ರಾಷ್ಟ್ರವಾಗಿದೆ. ಪಾಶ್ಚಿಮಾತ್ಯ ರಾಷ್ಟ್ರಗಳಿಗೂ, ಐರೋಪ್ಯ ರಾಷ್ಟ್ರಗಳಿಗೂ ಮತ್ತು ಭಾರತದ ವ್ಯವಸ್ಥೆಗೂ ಒಂದು ಹೋಲಿಕೆ ಹೇಗಿದೆ ಎನ್ನುವುದನ್ನ ಕುರಿತು ವಿಶ್ಲೇಷಿಸಿದ್ರು. ಜೊತೆಗೆ ರಾಷ್ಟ್ರ ನಿರ್ಮಾಣದಲ್ಲಿ ವಿವಿಧ ಭಾಷೆಗಳು ಚಾಲತಿಯಲ್ಲಿರುವುದು ಅಥವಾ ವಿವಿಧ ಭಾಷೆಗಳು ರಾಷ್ಟ್ರ ನಿರ್ಮಾಣಕ್ಕೆ ಅತ್ಯಂತ ಅಗತ್ಯ ಇರುವಂತ ಮಾತುಗಳನ್ನ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರು. ಭಾರತೀಯ ಗುರುತಿಸುವಿಕೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಹೇಗಿದೆ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಯುರೋಪಿಯನ್ಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ತಮಿಳು ಭಾರತೀಯ, ಮಲಯಾಳಿ ಭಾರತೀಯ, ಬೆಂಗಾಲಿ ಭಾರತೀಯ, ಪಂಜಾಬಿ ಭಾರತೀಯ ಎನ್ನುವಂತ ಮಾತುಗಳನ್ನು ಆಡಿದ್ರು. ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಕಾಂಗ್ರೆಸ್ ಇದು ಕುರಿತು ಹಲವಾರು ಸಮ್ಮೇಳನಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾತಾಡಿರೋ ಅನ್ನುವಂತ ಮಾತುಗಳನ್ನು ಆಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅವರ ಒಟ್ಟು ಭಾಷೆಯ ತಿರುಳು ಏನಾಗಿತ್ತು ಅಂದ್ರೆ, ರಾಷ್ಟ್ರ ನಿರ್ಮಾಣದಲ್ಲಿ ಭಾಷೆಗಳ ಕಗ್ಗಲೆ ಮಾಡುವುದು ಅರ್ಥವಿಲ್ಲ. ರಾಷ್ಟ್ರಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಆಯಾ ರಾಜ್ಯದ ರಾಷ್ಟ್ರಗಳನ್ನಿರಬೇಕು. 3 ಪ್ರಮುಖವಾದ ಮಹತ್ವದ ಅಂಶಗಳನ್ನು ಹೇಳಿದ್ರು. ಒಕ್ಕೂಟ ಸಂವಿಧಾನ ವ್ಯವಸ್ಥೆಯಲ್ಲಿ 1920-21ರಲ್ಲಿ ತಿಳಿಸಿರುವ ಹಾಗೆ ಅವರು ರಾಷ್ಟ್ರ ರಾಜ್ಯ ಅದು ವಿವಿಧತೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಏಕತೆಯನ್ನಾಗುತ್ತೆ. ವಿವಿಧ ಸಂಸ್ಕೃತಿಗಳ ರಾಜ್ಯ ಇದು ಕೂಡ ಐಕ್ಯತೆಗೆ ಕಾರಣ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. ರಾಜ್ಯ ರಾಷ್ಟ್ರಗಳ ನಿರ್ಮಾಣ ರಾಷ್ಟ್ರೀಯತೆ ನಿರ್ಮಾಣಕ್ಕೆ ಸಾಧ್ಯ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. ಒಟ್ಟಾರೆ ಅವರ ಮಾತುಗಳು ರಾಷ್ಟ್ರ ರಾಜ್ಯ ನಿರ್ಮಾಣದಲ್ಲಿ ಯಾವುದೇ ತಾರತಮ್ಯ ಮಾಡದು ಎನ್ನುವಂತ ಮಾತುಗಳಾಡಿರುವ ಪ್ರೊಫೆಸರ್ ಅಸ್ತೋಷ್ ಅವರಿಗೆ ಧನ್ಯವಾದಗಳು. ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ.
Thank you. Thank you to the National Law School. Thank you to the Government of Karnataka for inviting me here to this wonderful panel on a subject that I think is most crucial to the future of this nation and to the core of the democratic promise that this nation holds. It has been a challenge to be the last of three illustrious speakers before me, because everything I wanted to say has already been said. So I'm quickly going to rework it and focus the conversation a little bit on what I think are the four threats to the state-nation federal principle that is baked into our constitution. We cannot reaffirm federalism without understanding the nature of the threats and the tools and modalities that have now become normalized in our political discourse that are creating those threats in the first place. So let me start with the first. Today, our political discourse is enjoining us to abandon the project of state-nation within a new project of nation building, a project of one nation. We are told that we are a country that should mobilize around the idea of one nation, one tax, one nation, one ration card, one nation, one election. The use and deployment of the term one nation in and of itself fundamentally challenges the core element of what all three speakers spoke about that are critical to federalism. The asymmetry and accommodation, the multiplicities of identities. I am actually an embodiment of all the different identities that Professor Varshney just mentioned. I am a Tamil Indian, a Malayali Indian, and a Punjabi Indian all together into an Indian. And it is our federalism that allows me to be a proud Indian with all these multiplicities of identities. The asymmetry of our federalism is also being challenged in this embodiment of one nation. But what we need to understand is that it isn't just the phraseology of one nation, but what we are all being mobilized to stand for that underlies that phraseology. We are told that a one nation is an efficient nation. It is a nation that delivers its tax better. It is a nation that delivers its elections better. Perhaps it may increase your GDP. It is a nation that will allow people to move better. It will allow you to have portable benefits. And in all of this efficiency, we are being asked to give up on that very fundamental principle of accommodation. The Indian state is well known for all its efficiency failures, but when we are asked to respond to those efficiency failures within this framework of oneness as the path to efficiency, we are giving up a very fundamental element of what is core to the idea of federalism, to the notion of federalism that was baked into the original Indian constitution, which was meant, as Ambedkar reminded us, to have both unitary principles as well as federal principles that will always be in tension and in careful balance with one another. It was through that balance that the accommodative spirit of the Indian Constitution would be fulfilled. We cannot give that up in the guise of efficiency. We are also told, and this is the second big threat to federalism. Federalism at its core is about cooperation. Or federalism as articulated in the Indian Constitution is about cooperation. Professor Rao spoke to us about how this cooperation has been brought together and also broken consistently in the context of our fiscal federalism. But one of the elements of this cooperation is the absence of institutional structures that can enable and strengthen that federalism. Again, Professor Rao spoke about the absence of an interstate council, the lack of institutional spaces for dialogue and deliberation to take place. But I want to bring your attention to another element of this cooperation. Federalism in our civil services, the IAS, that Professor Varshney's presentation also mentioned. The IAS was designed to have within our federal structure as being framed within the concept of dual accountability. There were state cadres, and the Government of India borrowed its employees through these state cadres to ensure that in national policy making, the views, perspectives and ideas of the states would find representation, and similarly in state policy making, the idea of the holding together, the togetherness of our federal structure would articulate itself. Increasingly, as we have gone down the road of giving up or in the name of cooperation, beginning to increasingly centralize the nature of administration. How do we do that? We have the Prime Minister, we have Secretaries, Government of India monitoring progress of schemes with district magistrates, with secretaries of state governments. It fundamentally breaks the core of the principle of dual accountability. If a state civil cadre IAS officer is reporting directly to the Government of India without the Chief Secretary and the Chief Minister is as the intermediary, immediately the state becomes accountable to the center rather than, the IAS officer becomes accountable to the center rather than to the Chief Minister, to whom he or she ought to be accountable within the spirit of dual accountability. Another means by which the spirit of dual accountability is being undermined, and I think in ways that are even more onerous than administrative tools of monitoring, is the way in which we have so conveniently, and now with the backing of the Supreme Court, been able to convert states into union territories. Union territories with union cadres managed and held accountable by the central government. This is a serious challenge to the fundamental core of cooperative federalism that is baked in to the nature of the relationship between center and states. The third element that is becoming an increasing crisis of federalism brings us to the states. The principle of federalism in India is believed in by the center and states in a remarkably contingent manner. Everybody loves decentralization, Raja Chalaya had reminded us, but only up to their level. So states will go to the streets for their share of devolution, but states will not set up state finance commissions to give their rightful share of devolution to local governments. Governments of India and central finance commissions increasingly use tools of conditional fiscal transfers as a way essentially then to make local governments implementing arms of Government of India programs, leaving local governments with no funds, no functions, no functionaries. If we believe in the core principles of accountability, then states have to do their part of the bargain, which states, with very few exceptions, this state to a degree, Kerala to a degree, have consistently failed to do. This contingent commitment to federalism on the part of our politics remains one of the biggest threats overarchingly to ensuring that we reaffirm the principle of federalism. The fourth element of federalism that I believe is contributing to the crisis. India today is a far more mobile nation than it has been in its history. If we had a census, I would be able to give you some data on the extent to which India is moving, but certainly the north is moving to the south, and you can be in a restaurant in Chennai and order your dosa in Hindi, and a Bihari will come and give you that dosa. That's the extent to which India is moving. In an ideal world, this mobility of India should create for a dynamic exchange of culture, exchange of language, and a more cohesive national economy. But at this moment in time, it risks increasingly a sons of the soil imagination. We don't have the institutional structure to manage this mobility, that's for sure, but it gets undermined when state after state after state initiates its own legislation reserving jobs for those who belong to a particular state. If we believe that we are a genuinely federal nation where there is freedom of mobility across states, freedom to seek work across states, to ensure that there is minimum standards of public services delivered to all citizens across states, then both recipient states and states from which people are moving have to come together to commit themselves to a more to a holding together economy where people move and come together in search of jobs. Ultimately then, the way for the future of Indian federalism requires for a much deeper principled commitment to federalism, both on the part of states as well as the Government of India. Increasingly, the Government of India has played its part in ensuring that there is very little federalism and a lot of oneness. But for states to push back, they too have to play their part and ensure that their commitment to federalism, particularly vis-a-vis local governments that sits firmly within the arms of the state governments, are effectively empowered. But it's important for us also to think about two other elements that challenge this commitment to federalism. One, can you have genuine federalism in an extremely populist form of political democracy, where the presence of the leader, whether it is the Government of India or state governments, is the most central part of the identity of the political party and how services get delivered to all citizens. Technology plays its role through direct benefit transfers to ensure that the relationship between the citizen and the state is more or less mediated directly by the leadership. How do you then have a genuine multi-tiered governance architecture in this kind of centralized politics? And secondly, can we really have genuine decentralized politics when political parties by definition tend to operate in an extremely centralized way? Can you name me more than 5 ministers in state governments that have been Gram Panchayat presidents? We will only have genuine federalism when you have genuine political competition from the bottom up to the top. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Sayer. Can I request the translator?
ಪ್ರೊಫೆಸರ್ ಯಾಮಿನಿ ಅಯ್ಯರ್ ಅವರು ಮಾತುಗಳ ಪ್ರಾರಂಭಿಸುವುದಕ್ಕಿಂತ ಮುಂಚೆ ರಾಷ್ಟ್ರೀಯ ಕಾನೂನಿನ ಶಾಲೆ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕ ಸರ್ಕಾರಕ್ಕೆ ಧನ್ಯವಾದಗಳನ್ನು ತಿಳಿಸುತ್ತಾ ಕೇಂದ್ರ ರಾಜ್ಯ ಸರ್ಕಾರಗಳ ನಡುವೆ ತೊಂದರೆಗಳು ಮತ್ತು ಭಯಗಳ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಪಡಿಸಿದರು. ಅವರು 4 ಪ್ರಮುಖವಾದ ಭಯಗಳ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಪಡಿಸಿದರು. ಒಂದು ರಾಜಕೀಯವಾಗಿರಬೇಕಂತ ಭಯ, ಒಂದು ರಾಷ್ಟ್ರ, ಒಂದು ಚುನಾವಣೆ, ಒಂದು ದೇಶ, ಒಂದು ರೇಷನ್ ಕಾರ್ಡ್ ಎನ್ನುವಂತ ಮಾತುಗಳು. ಆದರೆ ವಿವಿಧತೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಏಕತೆ, ನಾನು ತಮಿಳು ಭಾರತೀಯ ಮತ್ತು ಪಂಜಾಬಿ ಭಾರತೀಯ ಹೌದು, ಒಕ್ಕೂಟ ವ್ಯವಸ್ಥೆ ಅವಕಾಶಗಳು ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದೆ, ನನಗೆ ಒಕ್ಕೂಟ ವ್ಯವಸ್ಥೆ ಅವಕಾಶ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದೆ ಎನ್ನುವಂತ ಮಾತುಗಳಾಡಿದ್ರು. ಅದ್ರ ಜೊತೆಗೆ ರಾಷ್ಟ್ರದ ಅಗತ್ಯವಾಗಿ ನಮ್ಮ ಸಮಾನತೆ ಮತ್ತು ಬದ್ಧತೆ ಕಾರ್ಯಗಳನ್ನ ಕೇಂದ್ರ ಮತ್ತು ರಾಜ್ಯ ಸರ್ಕಾರಗಳು ಎರಡೂ ಮಾಡಬೇಕು. ಭಾರತದ ಮೂಲ ಸಂವಿಧಾನದಲ್ಲಿ ಡಾಕ್ಟರ್ BR ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ ಅವರು ಹೇಳಿರುವ ಹಾಗೆ ಕೇಂದ್ರ ಮತ್ತು ರಾಜ್ಯ ಒಕ್ಕೂಟ ವ್ಯವಸ್ಥೆ ಪೂರಕವಾಗಿರುತ್ತೆ ಒಂದಕ್ಕೊಂದು. ಸಹಕಾರದ ಭಯ ಎರಡನೇದು. ಪರಸ್ಪರ ಆರ್ಥಿಕತೆಯಿಂದ ಒಕ್ಕೂಟ ವ್ಯವಸ್ಥೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಒಬ್ಬ IAS ಅಧಿಕಾರಿ ರಚನೆ ಮಾಡಿದಾಗ ಆತ ನೇರವಾಗಿ ಕೇಂದ್ರಕ್ಕೆ ಮನವಿಯನ್ನು ಕೊಡ್ತಾನೆ ಹೊರತಾಗಿ ರಾಜ್ಯ ಮಂತ್ರಿಗಳಿಗೆ ಮನವಿಗಳನ್ನ ಅಥವಾ ಹಾಲುಗಳನ್ನ ಕೊಡುವುದಿಲ್ಲ ಅನ್ನುವ ಮಾತುಗಳು ಹೇಳಿದ್ರು. ಮೂಲ ಆಶಯ ದ್ವಿನೀತಿ, ಡ್ಯುಯಲ್ ಆಟಿಟ್ಯೂಡ್ಸ್ ಇದೆ, ಅದನ್ನ ಹೋಗಲಾಡಿಸಬೇಕು ಅನ್ನುವಂತ ಮಾತು ಹೇಳಿದ್ರು. ಅದಲ್ಲದೆ ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಬಹಳ ಪ್ರಮುಖವಾಗಿ ರಾಜ್ಯ ಕೇಂದ್ರಗಳ ನಡುವೆ ವಿಕೇಂದ್ರೀಕರಣದ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಮಾತುಗಳು, ಡಿಸೆಂಟ್ರಲೈಸೇಷನ್ ಆಗ್ಬೇಕಾಗಿರುವಂತದ್ದು ಅಗತ್ಯ. ಅದ್ರ ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಕೇಂದ್ರ ರಾಜ್ಯಗಳ ನಡುವೆ. ಆಮೇಲೆ 4ನೇ ಭಯ ಏನು ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಆಧುನಿಕ ಸಮಸ್ಯೆಗಳ ಭಯ. ಇವತ್ತು ಜಗತ್ತಿನಲ್ಲಿ ನಾವು ಎಲ್ಲರೂ ಅತಿ ಹೆಚ್ಚು ಭಾರತದಲ್ಲಿ ಮೊಬೈಲ್ ಜಗತ್ತಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಬದುಕ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೇವೆ. ಅದರಿಂದ ಏನಾಗ್ತಾ ಇದೆ, ಸಂಸ್ಕೃತಿ, ರಾಷ್ಟ್ರೀಯತೆ ಮತ್ತು ಅರ್ಥಹೀನತೆಯಿಂದ ಬೇರೆದವರಿಗೆ. ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಜಾಗತೀಕರಣ ಮತ್ತು ಸರಳೀಕರಣ, ಉದ್ಯೋಗದಲ್ಲಿ LPG ಏನಂತೀವಲ್ಲ ಅದರ ಪರಿಣಾಮವಾಗಿ ಇವತ್ತು 2 ಪ್ರಮುಖವಾದ ಜನಸಂಖ್ಯೆಯ ಹೆಚ್ಚಳ ಮತ್ತು ನಾಯಕತ್ವದ ಸಮಸ್ಯೆಯನ್ನ ಕಾಣ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೇವೆ. ಅದನ್ನ ಸರಿಪಡಿಸಿದ್ರೆ ಈ ಒಂದು ಸಮ್ಮೇಳನಕ್ಕೆ ಅರ್ಥ ಬರುತ್ತೆ ಅನ್ನೋಕಂತ ಮಾತುಗಳನ್ನು ಆಡಿರುವಂತ ಮೇಡಮ್ ಅವರಿಗೆ ಧನ್ಯವಾದಗಳು. ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ.
Thank you. Since we have a few minutes, I first want to ask the panelists whether you want to react to anything other panelists have said before I open the floor. Can't hear? Okay, sorry. I was saying, since we have a bit of time before I open to the audience, is there anything that anyone of you want to add or comment on one of your co-panelists?
Yeah, I think we have had an excellent discussion, very eminent colleagues talking about federalism. I just want to say a couple of things on what Dr. Iyer mentioned. One is, in addition to all the things that she mentioned, there is the role of the governor. It's a colonial institution. At that time, at the colonial times, you needed a governor. But what is the governor doing now? Why? Apart from being an agent of the center, trying to sort of create a lot more of disharmony. That's one thing. Second thing is on the whole issue of decentralization below the state level. In my view, there is a birth defect in the entire scheme of 73rd and 74th constitutional amendment. The birth defect comes from the fact that in the 7th schedule under the state list, entry number 5 basically says that the responsibility for the local governments is that of the states. Then you have Article 243, which goes on discussing various aspects about the decentralization, and also scheduled 11 and 12, which basically gives a list of items which the state government may consider sharing with the local bodies. That means it may not also. When the local government may, and they can also share other responsibilities, which means that ab initio, the local bodies have no powers. Today, Bengaluru Municipal Corporation cannot appoint its municipal commissioner. It cannot, it has to be a state government man. It cannot change the property tax rates. It cannot change any rate because it has to seek the permission of the state government to do. There are state governments which abolish the property tax, as it happened in the case of Punjab. Now, so you have funds, functionaries and functions. There is complete ambiguity because the 7th schedule, the 11th and 12th schedules, you can do some activity mapping or whatever you want to do, but then there is no clarity on what is it that they are really supposed to do. Now, we have some in economics what we call the Coase theorem, which basically tells us that assuring a property right is very important for making any investments. So, clarity in assignment like giving property rights, and you don't have that as far as local bodies are concerned. I think if you really want the local bodies to thrive, I think we need to amend the constitution to give them clarity of their function, funds, sources of funds, and the functionaries. Thank you.
Yeah, Professor Vash.
And reduce the rotation period, which disincentivizes.
Two quick points. The reason we didn't have...
You have to hold the mic slightly
up. Close to this. Is this better? Or? The reason we didn't have the third tier of government right since 1950, and we had to create 73rd and 74th to generate the existence of 30. Because paradoxically, Mr. Ambedkar was completely opposed to the third tier of government, and he argued that it will only politically legitimate the pre-existing social and economic dominance of upper caste over Dalits. That's his argument. That it will make the position of Dalits worse, right? So he was happy to bring the power down to the state level, but not below the state level, for that reason. And there's a little bit of work available on that, but Madhav Khosla has in his chapter on decentering power, going through all that, he mentions all of that. But it should be recalled that there was a fundamental objection, and Nehru did not intervene into that after a point. Because Mr. Ambedkar, after you made him the chairman of the drafting committee, obviously he has a lot of power, and he's so fundamentally opposed to the third tier. Second, a quick comment. I mean, I've lived in America now for almost 4 decades. The local governments are pretty strong, but they are not in the Constitution. State governments are in the Constitution, and Washington is in the Constitution. Washington is the Constitution. There is no third tier of government that is constitutionally legitimated. It was left to the states to figure this out. And some states, even today, suspend local governments. So Michigan has so many times suspended Detroit local government. Right? So it's a very, I'm not saying that this particular, the last point is of great conceptual significance, but I think there's something comparative that can be done here to understand exactly how polities have handled local tier or third tier of government. Which is a very, very difficult issue historically and politically. I'm sure Yamini has something to say on that, which she thought a lot about.
No, I just very quickly wanted to say that there is another contradiction in the Indian context, which is if you look at the 30-plus year history of the 73rd and 74th Amendment, everything else has not been done, but elections has now more or less become part and parcel of the cycle of what takes place within the political activity of governance in India. What we really need to unpack is why does an elected set of elected representatives not mobilize when they are consistently and constantly being undermined. When we did some work here in Karnataka with Raghunandan, both of Raghunandan and I are students of Professor Rao on local governments, we discovered that of the 1 rupee of monies that are spent on activities that are meant to be spent by the panchayat only spends 3 paise. Only 3 paise touches the panchayat's account. Why are the sarpanches and ward panches not mobilizing politically, just like every state will be up in arms even today in such a centralized context if the Finance Commission, Central Finance Commission were not set up? So this, when you have elected bodies not becoming active political actors, that's a contradiction that I can't fully understand.
Thank you. I think we have time for one question. Anyone from the audience? Yeah. Nobody else? Yeah.
My question is to Professor Ashutosh. My name is Nirjar Manav and I'm from Christ University, Bangalore. So you talked about diversity is not being suppressed but institutions safeguarding while all India loyalty is also simultaneously nurtured. My question is to you, sir, what happens if one culture becomes dominant over others, and how do we handle that and strike a balance between the federalistic ideas of the nation?
Yes, I think the idea of federalism and certainly the way Gandhi thought about it, which resurfaced in the 1950s when we were linguistically reorganized, it is against linguistic majoritarianism. We talk about religious majoritarianism today, but linguistic majoritarianism was also for both Gandhi and Nehru a danger. Though for a little while they tried the idea of Hindi as a lingua franca of India along with something else. So the idea of 3 languages is born around that time, though it becomes formalized later. But for a little time, actually, they do toy with this. Both Gandhi and Nehru toy with the idea of Hindi as a lingua franca. But they drop it. They realize that this is not doable, and this will undermine India, not build India. This will undermine India, not build India. So they give it up. If that's what you have in mind, then certainly Mr. Ambedkar's, I don't remember his comments on this issue. I don't think he engaged language at all, as far as I know. I think Sudhir would know better. but I don't think he engaged language as an issue at all. But my sense is that he would, given what all we have read about the way he wants to structure the polity, he would also be against linguistic majoritarianism. And not giving one, let's say Hindi, which is spoken by 40% of India, 39.8 according to 2011, allowing it to just dominate every part of India. I think he would be opposed to that, given the way he thought about the polity.
Thank you. I think we've just finished exactly on time. On behalf of the Government of Karnataka and the National Law School, I thank all the panelists for this fascinating discussion we've had, and for everyone here in the hall for participating. Thanks a lot. Thank you.